Hello, my name's Amanda from Disability ACT. This is a question for Andrew. Andrew, I wondered if you could speak to us a little more about the physical access and the physical build things that are important for people with intellectual disability and acquired brain injury in terms of connecting them with their community and what is the best way to make that look. You talked about wayfinding, but what are the other components there that you've discovered?
Thank you very much for the question. I think the wayfinding issue clearly relates to the internal design of the building, but I think wayfinding also has to relate to the setting of the dwelling within its neighbourhood. So there needs to be clear pathways to access to public transport, clear ways of finding access to shops and other facilities. I think that's an important issue. I think one of the key messages to come out of the social housing sector in particular, but also some of the literature, is that it's important that persons with intellectual disability are integrated into their community. And so partly I think the model is dwellings where you have some people with intellectual disability living, but also potentially some people without intellectual disabilities who may provide some forms of support. That seems to be a critical issue. And I think we're all familiar with the common ground model as it's been rolled out in various parts of Australia, where you have people who are homeless living in apartment blocks and other forms of accommodation with other non-homeless residents. And I think the idea is very similar in that you integrate persons with intellectual disability in the home within with persons without intellectual disabilities. Sometimes there'll be support workers formally, but sometimes it's just members of the community who choose to live in those settings. I think a really important issue also...
So the caption can...
Okay, sure. I think a second important issue is that there shouldn't be concentrations of developments where persons with intellectual disability are living in a courtyard where there might be 15, 20, 25 dwellings. Unfortunately, that's often the most efficient way of doing it, but it's not necessarily the best. And I think one of the things I took from your presentation was the individualised approach, and it has to be an individualised approach. So there are elements of design that go into the building, there are elements of the design that go into the neighbourhood setting, but also it's the individualised approach and the integration with the broader social context that's so important. Thank you.
Josh Vasaico from Sustained Community Housing. It's good to see the graphs and hear it all about it, but what do you think is the issue to solve the problem of not enough accommodation?
Was there anybody that you particularly were directing that at?
It goes towards the whole panel.
Okay, great. Well, I might start off with Gerald then.
Yeah, look, thanks for that question, because that comment about there not being enough housing keeps popping up. There's not a lot we're going to be able to do about that in the current climate, particularly now that there's been cuts to funding at the federal level. But I would say we, particularly here in the ACT, and I think there are other areas as well, that there are other opportunities in public housing if it's well managed. And I think the 10 years that we've been working at this with housing supports that premise that there is accommodation, and we need to be working with what we've got at the moment, and not saying that we can't do anything because there's a lack of. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me about Gerald's presentation is just how proactive the ACT government appears to have been on this issue. I think they're to be commended in terms of targeting the supply of public housing to persons with disabilities of various forms, including, of course, intellectual disability. That's a really important and really great step by the ACT government. But as Gerald's noted, there is really a funding horizon which is closing in on everyone in the social housing sector. And so we can't expect an increasing supply across Australia of social housing for persons with intellectual disability as much as they might deserve it and as much as we might want to give it to them. So I guess the question is, what's the alternative? And I think the alternative partly has to be about mobilising communities. And I think since about 2000, maybe a little bit later than that, there has been increasing attention paid to, well, what can the community sector do? What can the community sector do? And how can we mobilise those resources. So partly I think it's about, well, what can family members do to better direct their resources and efforts to provide long-term housing solutions for persons with a disability? And that's going to be part of the equation. I don't think there's a simple solution. There's no silver bullet. I think partly it's about how do we engage with community service providers about the support they provide. It's partly about engaging with philanthropics about what sort of support they'll provide. So I have a relationship with an organisation called the Wyatt Trust, which is the oldest philanthropic in Australia, and they've been providing both rental support but also some limited capital grants to help people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. So how do we direct those sorts of resources from the philanthropic sector into meeting the needs of this key group? What is the conversation we need to have with politicians, and what is the conversation we need to have with the NDIA in terms of making better use of the resources that are available? Clearly the NDIS isn't going to provide accommodation for every person with an intellectual disability in Australia, and certainly not everyone with a mild intellectual disability. But what's the conversation we can have about exploring those issues? And I think it really has to be community-led, because it's a community issue. It's not just about the well-recognised philanthropics, the well-recognised charities. It's also about Rotary. It's also about Probus. What can they do to help with this issue? And I think that's really where we need to get traction. We need to be mobilising all the resources within the community, because they're considerable, and getting solutions. And I think one of the things that I really liked about your presentation was that clearly many residents, many members of the community generally are willing to buy into this issue, when a gut reaction might well be, just get rid of them. Get them out. They're bad tenants. Let's use whatever procedures we can legally to get rid of them. And that's not the case. And I think that speaks to a broader concern across the Australian community to find real solutions to these very terrible issues.
Hi, I'm Fiona May from Atticus. We're an advocacy service. We have a number of clients over the years which are young people who are seeking to pursue typical housing careers. So they've moved out of home and moved into shared accommodation or renting in the private market, and they're running into trouble because the social context and support of the sort that Gerard is providing in the public housing space isn't available to them. They're being taken advantage of by the people that they're sharing the house with, or by the landlords who are, overcharging and undersupplying in terms of, allowing them to use electricity and hot water and some of those fundamental needs that we all have in our homes. And they're therefore being pushed into the social housing sector because the private housing sector, which ought to be able to respond and which they've got enough capacity to live in, if you just look at themselves, isn't able to respond and isn't choosing to respond. So I think that there's another layer of the social context to this that really needs some work. How do we change the attitudes of landlords, of rental agents, of other young people who are sharing homes, so that people can have a more typical housing career, even if they live with mild cognitive impairment?
I'd like to make the point that the service that we provide is not driven by public housing. It's driven by the concept that we as a service provider developed all those years ago, and I tried to get that message across, that it's not restricted to public housing and high density. The support needs to work across the sector, across the community. Whether it's private rental or public rental, it doesn't matter. It's the individual that matters. So what we're looking for is a greater number of responses and a greater understanding by the sector of where the boundaries extend to rather than where they stop. And I think that's the problem, is that too many people say, no, this is our boundary, this is our purview, and we can't go beyond it, when in fact we can go as far as we need to go.
Yeah, I think this is also an example of where community broadly can be held responsible. So I think one of the first issues should be having a discussion with the Real Estate Institute and the ACT about the issue, and what are their attitudes on it? What are they willing to do? And I think then it's a matter of potentially keeping real estate agents accountable. We know that the private rental market in Australia is dominated by mum and dad investors working on a very small scale. But what is constant is the real estate sector. And they buy and sell those real estate roles all the time. It's a valuable asset for them. And if they can be an accredited and recognised provider of accommodation for that particular group with a great reputation, I think that would be something that they would value. And we know that many real estate firms are engaged in the community at all sorts of levels, from Rotary clubs upwards and downwards. And why don't we use that to leverage them to change their behaviours? Why don't we use that, and when they don't do the right thing, hold them accountable? You know, do you publish a report on the number of instances of this each year? Does the Canberra Times discuss this ever? These are the sorts of issues, and these are the sorts of ways we can actually reshape behaviour in the housing market. But I don't know what to do about other tenants.
Just on that, I'd like to make another comment that it's not the responsibility of the tenancy providers, private or public, to provide support as such. Their role is to manage property rentals. It's the responsibility of the service sector to find other ways of meeting the needs and supporting people to sustain their tenancies wherever that may be.
Look, thank you for that. We've got time for one more question. I'd also just like to say, just in terms of continuity from previous forums, we've actually had the Real Estate Institute of the ACT engaged in some previous discussions, and we certainly have welcomed their commitment to some ongoing dialogue about how we can provide pathways and opportunities for people with a disability to access private rental accommodation. So from an industry association perspective, there's some interest and a desire to continue the conversation, but it's a conversation we should all be a part of.
Hi, I'm Steve Fox from National Disability Services. My question, firstly a comment. We've certainly also heard that message around the real estate sector, and we're keen to explore some further discussions and looking at ways in which we might be able to do that with service providers. I guess my question arises from Gerald's presentation, and it's in relation to your point of entry, Gerald, and who pays for the service that you provide. We're all moving into the NDIS. We're conscious that it's a learning environment for us here, and I'm wondering about the extent to which the range of pricing and clusters within the NDIS pricing framework would support the kind of work that you've just described, Gerald, and whether you have any views on that.
This has been a question we've been pondering for the last couple of years. What is going to happen to homelessness funding? Remembering that that homelessness funding is not just for people who are homeless, but for those who are at risk. And if we are brave enough, we will use that at-risk interpretation to be able to provide the sorts of supports. As I've indicated there, this is not an ongoing process. In fact, it shouldn't be thought to be as an ongoing process for an individual, that there is a longer term intervention to their level of risk of homelessness. So perhaps our thoughts should not be how much more can we extract from the NDIS, but how much more effort do we need to put into the argument for an extended homelessness program in Australia generally? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. In South Australia at the moment, the state government's running a series of forums where they're looking at preparing the sector into the future, thinking about a possible haircut of 30% of funding, because that's what the MPAH dropping would mean for the sector, and it's not a very happy set of providers out there. I think more broadly, however, one of the principles that has come out of a series of discussions in South Australia and homelessness services in particular is that really the way forward is to mainstream those services. So if there is a way to tap into mainstream services, it's always going to be better than relying on specialist homelessness service for a range of political, cultural and other reasons. An example people often point to, of course, is Wintringham, which provides homelessness services to people who have older age. And the Wintringham model was built on aged care funding, not on homelessness funding. And that seemed to be more robust, more reliable, and produce in many ways very good outcomes. So I think maybe it's partly a challenge of having that discussion with NDIS about what they can do and what they can provide. And if they can't do much now, in the future, what can they do? And talk to your politicians about that.
Well, it's now time for morning tea. We've reached the end of our first session. It's been a fantastic discussion so far. After we reconvene in about 20 minutes' time, session 2 will focus on good housing design and technology for people with moderate and severe disability. But before morning tea, I'd like you to warmly thank our 2 speakers today, Professor Beer and Gerald Franks. Thank you.